care, let go of him. So even though they were a part of the scene that was going on in the 70s and Quiet Riot there and George Lynch and Wyatt McBrown are playing with the boys and, you know, the whole story about Gene Simmons coming to really see the boys, but he takes back Van Halen. Like, yeah, some of these other bands had some interest, and they were peers of Van Halen, but Van Halen were also just operating on this completely separate level from really anyone else at the time, even though it still took them a little while to break, and even though, like, a lot of people saw them, didn't think of them as necessarily a sure thing. But once it happened, it was like, of course this was going to happen. And it doesn't mean that they're, you know, just having the success because they're part of a wave. Like, they are going to have that success whether the wave happens or not.
Sure, absolutely. Now, how did you guys go about putting this book together? How many interviews did you do, and what other footage did you use to help infiltrate interviews? What was the process behind the book?
We did about 200 interviews for the book, and 85% of what you see in the book is stuff from our interviews. You know, both Rich and I have been music journalists for like 20 years, so we've interviewed people over the course of our careers that we have stuff, you know, material from that we used if we needed to. And then if we really had to, you know, we would go to outside sources for things and quote other things if we needed to. There's one actual person who is incredibly helpful and generous with Stephen Rosen, who's a noted, you know, Van Halen expert, and he's helped us a lot in that area. But basically, I mean, we hit the pavement. We did 200 interviews over the course of 3.5 years. Most of what you're seeing is either me or Rich getting, you know, on the phone with someone in the last couple of years and doing like as long as an interview as they would tolerate with us. And then once we got all the material, we had to, the fun part and the hard part is weaving it all together into this one sort of story where you've got all these voices, you know, and that took quite a lot of work doing that, and then, you know, sort of wrangling it together so it wasn't, you know, the book probably could have been 800 pages instead of 500 pages. It probably wouldn't have been as good, but we definitely had the material to make this thing run much longer given how many transcripts we had accumulated.
One of the first things you do in the book is you interview Michael Anthony. Tell me about that interview. You chose to kind of focus on the very, very early days with Van Halen. And I was wondering, how was Michael Anthony with you, and how come you chose to just speak about the bar days?
Well, I spoke with Michael, and I think that right off the bat, I mean, even before we spoke with him, we knew that that's what we were going to focus on, because that's really the part of the story where Van Halen is a part of this book, actually. I mean, you know, throughout the 80s, we don't really follow the Van Halen story because, again, like as much as they were sort of forming separately from this while also being a part of it in the 70s, it was the same thing in the 80s. They're not really, all these bands love Van Halen and all the fans love Van Halen, but Van Halen is not really part of the quote-unquote hair metal scene. And that was one of the things even that Michael Anthony spoke about in our interview, that he acknowledges, like, yeah, all these guys talk about Van Halen as an influence, and yeah, you started to see all these bands where it was like three dark-haired guys and the blonde-haired lead singer. You know, Van Halen never wore makeup. Like, we weren't really doing this thing the way that they were doing it in the 80s, and when you think about it, it's like, yeah, that's true. I mean, they dressed sort of outlandishly. They also didn't dress in, like, costumes in the sense that they were all matching and things like that. I mean, Dave had his gay thing, and Eddie had his crazy, you know, Eddie thing with the stripes and all that clothes, and we did the guitar, but, like, it wasn't this sort of thing the way some, you know, Motley Crue in their Shout at the Devil era. So they were really very separate once the scene took off. And, however, in telling how this scene came together, it was super important to get the Van Halen perspective in there, because all of these bands, especially the ones on the strip that were there in the early 80s, are, you know, undoubtedly super influenced by Van Halen. They all talk about it in the book. They all, you know, guys like Stephen Pearcy are talking about seeing Van Halen at the Whiskey in the 70s and just, you know, being blown away. And so they had that was the part that we wanted to focus on when it came to Van Halen, like the impact that they had on the bands that came after. And Michael was great at giving some insight into that, and also giving insight into, because we spent so much time on the strip in the 80s, you need insight from the guys that were there in the 70s. And a lot of the early Quiet Riot guys are in the book, and they talk about it, and some other bands too, like the guys from Snow and and obviously George Lynch and Don Dokken, like you need that perspective of the guys that were sort of there pre the explosion.
Van Halen's position is such an interesting one because they sort of kind of set the template for the scene. They're not really part of the scene. They kind of break up before the scene's about to happen. They resume with Sammy Hagar, but they're almost very separate from the scene, even with Hagar. So how would you explain their sort of sphere? I mean, they're still in the hard rock scene, but they're still not a part of these guys, even though a lot of these guys are either their peers that they came up with, like Rat and Quiet Riot and Dokken, or they're totally, completely influenced by them, yet they kind of sit outside of it. Why do you think they have such a unique perspective?
It's interesting because, when Dave goes solo, he actually kind of moves closer to the scene than Van Halen does. Like when I saw David Lee Roth on the Skyscraper tour and Poison was opening for him, and I know he also had, I believe, Cinderella opening for him, and so sort of when he goes solo, he embraces the scene more because I think he recognizes that that's where the fans are, and so if he's going to take a young band out, it should be one of these new hot bands that sort of worship Van Halen. I think a lot of it has to do with, especially with the Sammy Hagar era Van Halen. I think they had done the thing. I think that by then, Van Halen, they were aware that, like, they needed to, like, they weren't going to sort of, like, it was probably smarter not to compete on the same turf as, like, these Motley Crue guys and the Poison guys and, like, these younger dudes sort of doing their trip, but they were smart to move into like a more of a, almost like a classic rock or an MOR area. And I think also that honestly, Eddie Van Halen, he realized that he was the greatest, and he was obviously recognized as the innovator, and it's not like anyone ever stole his thunder, but I think that he was still always annoyed that an entire generation of guitarists had copped his trick. I don't think he ever really got over that. I don't think that he was like thrilled about it. And so I think that, and I'm totally hypothesizing here, but I don't really have any real memories of Van Halen taking out quote unquote hair metal bands as their support act. So, I mean, I've heard one story about maybe Autograph was opening for Van Halen, like, Steve Lynch was tapping and Van Halen was like, whoa, like unacceptable. I think that there was a desire within Van Halen, and particularly maybe Eddie, to like distance themselves from what he thought were imitators, and I think that he wasn't thrilled about being so blatantly copied. I don't think it bothered Dave that a lot of singers were blonde and animated. I don't think that he felt that he was being robbed as much, but I think for Eddie, it really did rub him the wrong way. So I think when they did have the opportunity to go sort of in a more mature direction with Sammy, they took it, and they were like, all right. But it's funny because, Dave actually moves closer.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he jumps in, and it's funny because what do you think would have happened had Van Halen continued with Roth?
Well, look, you see the shift happening anyway, right? With 1984 and Jump, which is what sparks a lot of what winds up happening with Van Halen. So clearly, that whole keyboard thing would have still been a thing. Would they have made a song like Love Walks In? Probably not. I also don't think they would have made Eat 'Em and Smile. They would have been more like Van Halen throughout the 80s, but they would not have been the Van Halen of Women and Children First throughout the 80s. Probably would have kept progressing a little bit from the 1984 thing, and I think that still goes back a little bit to what Tom was just talking about. I mean, clearly Eddie could shred with the best of them and actually better than all of them, but that wasn't what he was attempting to do. He was just doing his own thing, and he came into it from a completely different, entry point, because it actually in some ways didn't exist before he did it. When you would read interviews with Eddie, and especially Tom and I are both Guitar World people, and when you would read these interviews in guitar magazines, if he was talking about the stuff he was influenced by, it was always Cream, and it was always Billy Gibbons and that kind of stuff. But when he was talking about his contemporaries, it was always guys like Alan Holdsworth, Steve Lukather. Those aren't the dudes that George Lynch was talking about and these other 80s shredders. They were just, Eddie was living in a different world, even as he was the guy sort of leading the shredder world. I don't think that Dave being there would have kept them in it necessarily.
Yeah. Now, tell me about your tenure at Guitar World. What was your experience like working with Eddie Van Halen, and how important was he to Guitar World?
He was the king. I got to go to 5150 twice. I interviewed Eddie for a cover story for Guitar World in 1994 around balance, and then I interviewed him again a couple years later when he switched from Ernie Ball to PV guitars. Also was sort of like friendly with Matt Bruck. He's sort of like tech guy and like all around guy. So I got to go to 5150 a couple of times. But Eddie, like the importance of Eddie Van Halen to Guitar World magazine, like cannot be measured. And this is back in a time when magazines, like when I was at Guitar World in the 90s, we were selling hundreds of thousands of copies every issue. You know what I mean? We were selling a lot. Like magazines were a thing. And Eddie Van Halen was a guaranteed hit. You put Eddie on the cover, and you're going to sell magazines. And there's not that many. You would think there were that many guys that can do that.
Right.
But like Eddie and Jimmy Page were the two guys who were really the best sellers. Like, you know, Hendrix sold and Stevie Ray Vaughan sold, but like it was really Eddie and Page. So we were very careful when I was there. And then Brad Polinski, who was sort of like my mentor and was quoted a lot in the book in subsequent years.
Yeah.
He was the editor of Guitar World for years. Maintaining the relationship with Eddie Van Halen was incredibly important because we wanted to be able to get him on the cover at least once a year. There was a lot of work putting into maintaining the relationship, particularly, you know, like in the years, like sort of like in those years, like I want to say like 2008, 9, 10, when maybe Eddie wasn't like doing so well mentally. I think there was a lot of care put into like sort of the relationship at that time too. He's the king for Guitar Magazine, and deservedly so. I mean, like in my mind, he's the best ever, but like an incredibly important piece of Guitar Magazine history and like one of the all-time bestsellers.
Now, do you think with his passing that Van Halen will grow in terms of importance in the music history, or do you think it'll wane?
It's hard to say. I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think that, you know, you see a lot of people actually that the influence, some of these guys that we just assumed would always be at the top, you know, just in terms in people's minds and like, you know, just how they're talked about. Like the influence wanes because, you know, rock is not as dominant as it once was, and classic rock is not as dominant. So like the way when we were growing up, you know, even in the 80s and the 90s, like everybody knew every Zeppelin song and every Beatles song. Like you just had this sort of basis that you were all working from that was all kind of the same stuff. And I don't know if that's the case anymore. And I think with Eddie, in my opinion, is like insane as his playing is and as mind-blowing and over the top as it is, like actually one of the things that really makes him special and really makes him great are the more subtle aspects of his playing. His rhythm playing, his sense of rhythm, phrasing, like some of the notes he chooses, like all of this sort of bizarre stuff that you don't really hear in rock and roll otherwise. I mean, you certainly didn't hear before Eddie. And I don't know that those types of pieces will get appreciated in the same way because they won't be as obvious. And if the first thing you think about when you think about Eddie Van Halen, which is the first thing everyone thinks about, is the pyrotechnics. You know, Eruption doesn't sound as impressive nowadays as it did back then because there's 8-year-olds that can do stuff that's actually like 20 times as difficult as Eruption, like YouTube every day. So I don't know if it will take more explaining to convince a teenager now and certainly in the future about why this is so mind-blowing when they can just go on YouTube and find some schlub playing something that's actually harder than what Eddie did.
Now, you know about the Hendrix legacy and how they kind of really curate the Hendrix legacy, releasing different things, different movies, different CD album releases. Van Halen is not really strong in that department when it comes to that stuff. Do you think that that's going to be key going forward, is putting out releases, unreleased stuff, uncovered stuff, live stuff? Or do you think that that's why Page and also, you know, Hendrix, their legacy gets kind of more and more intense because of the different releases and reminds people of their magistry?
I mean, I think one thing that will keep Eddie alive and does keep Eddie alive and that he put a tremendous amount of his passion into in later years was his guitar company and his equipment company.
Okay.
And it's a weird thing, but like in one of the ways in which Eddie continues to live on and sort of really integrate into like younger generations of musicians is that like the EVH amps are like the go-to hard rock amp for everyone. And his gear, which he wasn't just putting his name on it, you know, he was putting huge amounts of effort into the R&D and stuff. So I think that helps to like keep the awareness of them. I think the thing that